This is the demonstration of a wax up of a class 2 cavity of the lower left second premolar. In this video, you will be introduced to the steps that you'll need to follow so that you can master the technique of waxing up your tooth. First of all, you need to light up your alcohol lamp, and using your PK1 instrument, you will heat it up for a count of 1, 2, 3 into the fire, so that it's not overheated or underheated. And then you dip it in the wax, carry the wax, just a little bit of wax, and then spread it over the tooth surface. As you can see in here, you will know that the wax is in the correct temperature if you place it on your finger, for example, like in the video. If it's too hard, then you need to heat it up. You go 1, 2 into the fire, and then you need to create a spot-like wax model. If you heat it too much, then the wax would be spread, as you can see here, and that's not the correct technique. What you need is that the spot creates a triangular head, which is called a spotty or a spot, and then that's the correct technique. Now you take just a tiny drop of wax and then you spread it over the missing surface. You do not want to heat the wax too much or the instrument too much. You just need to heat it just enough so that you can control the flowability of the wax over the tooth. Now, if you look here, if there's smoke coming out of the wax, then you are heating your instrument too much, as you can see. And then you will need to cool it down just a little bit. Maybe tap it on the sheets you have or the paper, and then you don't dip it too much, just a tiny bit. As you can see, you then start filling up the missing surfaces, the missing parts of the tooth, all over the sides and over the different mesial and distal surfaces. Now, as we are layering the wax, we will need, after finishing the first layer, we will need to leave it to cool down so that it doesn't completely go out. Now, before you put your tooth into the jaw and check the mesial and the distal contacts, you will need to add a little bit of Vaseline on the adjacent teeth surfaces. We have already done that step. It's just a simple swap of Vaseline over the surfaces of the adjacent teeth. This should prevent the wax from getting stuck on the adjacent tooth and then completely getting out when you are taking the tooth out to check it. As you can see now, we are filling up the mesial contact side. You just need to follow the anatomy of the tooth surface, the contours, and there should be no drops between the filling, which is the wax, and the tooth surface you're trying to replace, and the tooth surface that's already there for you to follow. You just need to follow the anatomy, creating the different anatomical landmarks, as you can see in the video. The technician is still waxing up, filling up the surface, the missing surfaces. As we said, you need to wait to leave it to cool down after you fill the first layer or the second layer. Each and every layer should have a pause so that the wax cools down, it's not heated anymore, and that you can add up another layer without jeopardizing the work you've already accomplished. Now the technician is creating the distal contact point, and then we will need the jaw to check if the shape, the contour, and the place of the contact is in the correct position. We can use the other tooth to see and check the anatomy and to recreate the anatomy to the similar way to the opposite tooth in the same jaw. And we use the adjacent teeth to fill up the contacts in the correct way. As you can see here, he's used the adjacent tooth as a reference, and now he is recreating the anatomy of the marginal ridge and the contact areas He is rechecking the anatomy and that what he has recreated is correct. The contours of the marginal ridges, the height of the marginal ridges in the occluso cervical direction, and the area, as you can see in the contact, is in the correct way. This can be done using first the anatomy of the tooth itself, just following on the contours of the tooth. Second, using the adjacent teeth. And third, using the opposite tooth in the same jaw. The same tooth in the same jaw on the other side would tell you about the anatomy, how deep or how wide, etc. Now you remove any extras, making sure that the surfaces are well contoured. There are no extras, no wedges or bulges coming out of the box on the side, on the mesial or on the distal side. Now you need to make sure that the height of the marginal ridge is well adapted to the adjacent tooth. Now, as you can see, we're almost done with the final outside anatomy. And once we're done, we will use the adjacent tooth to recreate the internal anatomy or the inside of the crown anatomy. This includes the contour of the marginal ridges, the triangular fossae on the mesial and the distal side, and the central groove that crosses both from the mesial towards the distal side or the opposite, making sure that we follow the contours of the cusps and the transverse ridges of each cusp is reproduced and recreated as it was missed when the tooth was prepared. Now we're double checking the contours are correct. If we need to increase a little bit more of the marginal ridges, we would do so lightly. This is a skill that you will learn through time and practice, but it is one of the most important skills you will need in your dental career in the future. So practice makes perfect. Keep practicing and you will get to the point where you want. As you can see, the contour of the marginal ridge is working well with the adjacent. If any wax is left on the adjacent tooth, you immediately remove it. This would be very easy with the Vaseline placed on the adjacent teeth. Now we recheck that the contacts / height / contour and shape is correct. We remove any excess wax, nice and slow. We take our time until the wax is completely hardened. And now we start carving the anatomy with the carver, amalgam carver, or the PK number 2. Instruments. So you choose your amalgam carver, which has a sharp surface and it follows the contours of the tooth itself. And you can use the Lacrum carver as well to remove any excess, as it has a sharp knife-like. And now with the amalgam carver, you place it on the tooth surface and then you start carving the wax. So basically you use the surface of the tooth that's still remaining as a reference, and then you go through above the wax, making sure that there is no edges and that there are no missing surfaces. You're following the anatomy of the tooth, following the curvatures of the tooth surface, including the cusp tips through the transverse ridges, the marginal ridges, and then creating the fossae similar to the adjacent tooth. Now you keep recreating the anatomy to the level you think you're satisfied with how the tooth looks. following the margins, following the contours and the tiny ridges and edges on the tooth surface itself. You can use the PK number 3 and number 2 to recreate the anatomy. Whatever instrument you can use can be well mastered so that you can recreate your foci and your margin ridge. As you can see, the anatomy looks very nice and looks as a natural tooth. Again, we have reproduced the main landmarks in the anatomy. We just need to make sure that we clean any extra wax on the tooth surface, and that the wax is only confined to the cavity, nicely continuous across the tooth surface. There are no lines that are not nice. Now we need to check the occlusion, so we put the tooth back in the jaw. We use the articulating paper. This is blue wax, and so we will use the red side of the articulating paper. And now if you're using the orange wax, you can use the blue side of the articulating paper. Those are just initial looks, seeing if there are any extras that needs to be taken out. And now the technician is going to be using the articulating paper. As I said before, we'll be using the red side of the articulating paper, as that would look, we will be able to see the red spots on the articulating paper. Now, what you need to see when you're checking the occlusion is that the points created from occlusal stops are continuous across the whole of the other teeth, especially the adjacent. If your wax is too high, it will prevent the nice distribution of the occlusal stops, which are just dots of the ink from the articulating paper distributed nicely over the majority of the teeth. If you have too much wax, then that would not happen. If you have the correct amount of wax, then the distribution of the occlusal stops will be harmonious and continuous across the whole of the teeth that has been examined. Now we're just checking that there are no excess wax on the sides and across the whole. This is just finishing steps. Those are just finishing. The finishing takes much time than the initial add up. It's all about the final touches that gives the tooth its beautiful shape and contours and anatomy. So any extra work, you should be careful at this step though, not to lose the initial beautiful work that you have done. Just checking all sides. The tooth looks brilliant to me, as you'll see in later in a closer look. Now the articulating paper would be used to check the occlusal contacts. We can use a gauze or a tissue to give a shiny appearance to the sides and the occlusal surface of the tooth. As you can see, the triangular foci, the central groove, and the transverse ridge on the crown are all nicely done. Now we check with the articulating paper. You do that a couple of times so that you can make sure that there's enough ink distributed across the entire dentition. As you can see, we have occlusal stops in red over most of the teeth in contact, which is great, but we have a little bit extra wax on this point, so we are going to remove it, just carving it nice and slow. Making sure there's no high contacts that prevents the harmonious occlusion and occlusal stops among all of the teeth when they are in the maximum intercuspal position. So that's it. This is the final product. I hope you enjoy the wax up. It's beautiful and it develops lots of skills, and it makes you understand the overall concept of the anatomy and why we're studying this course. You should be able to see all the different aspects. Thank you very much.